Mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, chers étudiants, chers amis, quelques mots en français pour vous saluer et vous souhaiter une très cordiale bienvenue. Nous sommes très heureux d'organiser ce soir, en partenariat avec le Comité international de la Croix-Rouge, cette conférence à l'occasion, j'entends des retours ici, non ? À l'occasion des 70 ans des conventions de Genève, des documents très importants, pas seulement parce qu'elles ont élargi le champ de la protection des combattants aux civils, mais aussi parce que, parlant des civils, elles avaient l'ambition et gardent l'ambition de fortifier la civilité dans l'espèce humaine. Et la civilité, ça veut dire de faire progresser le processus de civilisation, le processus qui nous amène à respecter l'humain dans l'autre et de nous faire trouver les moyens de pacifier les relations à l'intérieur des sociétés et entre les sociétés. C'est donc une belle occasion d'entendre un bilan sur les 70 ans de ces conventions, et personne n'est mieux placé, n'est mieux qualifié que le président du CICR pour le faire. Et c'est donc pour nous un grand plaisir que d'accueillir Peter Maurer, président du CICR depuis 7 ans, diplomate professionnellement, secrétaire d'État au département fédéral des affaires étrangères avant de prendre son poste, qui conduit cette organisation très importante pour l'action humanitaire et pour la promotion des conventions de Genève. Merci à vous, cher Peter, d'avoir accepté de faire ce bilan.
Thank you, Philippe. Thanks, colleagues and friends. It's always a pleasure to speak at a graduate institute and with an audience here in Geneva. There may not be a topic closer to the concern and at the heart of ICRC than tonight's discussions. And our mandate to protect and to alleviate suffering in wartime, Philippe has mentioned it, stems from the Geneva Conventions of 1949, even if our history, as everybody knows in this room, goes back further than 1949. For me, this discussion tonight is not about anniversaries or debates on legal phrasing. It is about protecting people from the worst of wars which rage today. It's about laws that assert that as long as conflict remains a reality, there also must be a limit to suffering. 70 years ago in this city, a diplomatic conference was convened by Switzerland. The conference opened on the 21st of April of 1949 at the old Palais du Conseil Général, nowadays Unidufour. It brought together representatives from almost all states at the time, with the ICRC present as an expert in that diplomatic conference. Fresh in the minds of those present were the enormous horrors of the Second World War. The battlefields and the Holocaust had brought humanity to the edge of the abyss and laid bare the glaring gap in legal protection for civilians. States shared a strong resolve to never see such destruction repeated, and binding obligations to protect civilians, everyday men, women, and children, were set down in international laws in a comprehensive way for the first time. Together, the world agreed that even during armed conflict, there remain limits as to what we as nations, communities, brothers and sisters can do to each other. This was a powerful concept brought into conventional law. So strong was the humanitarian spirit and the determination to reduce suffering that the negotiations lasted only 4 months. This is almost unthinkable in today's shaky multilateral system, but it also shows to what states are able to advance if they take responsibility and have the courage to uphold principles. The success, though, was of course also the result of professional long-term engagement, which allowed the drafters and negotiators to formulate a legal agreement that connected the recent history of the Second World War with the experiences, and doing so to transcend time and space. The process was also not without difficulty. Everybody knows it recognized the dilemmas, including the legitimate rights of states to security, designing IHL to navigate between military necessity and humanitarian concern in order to achieve the best protection for people affected by the conflicts. Today, the 4 Geneva Conventions are among the very few international treaties that have been universally ratified, not least because they reflect more than just law. They reflect universal values of ethical behavior. While it is true that the Geneva Conventions are synonymous with the city of Geneva, they are designed for the dirty front lines of war. International humanitarian law cannot be confined to words in glossy legal texts. Its power resides on the battlefields of the Syrias, Afghanistans, Iraqs, the South Sudans, and the Central African republics of our world today. It was militaries and humanitarians who devised these laws and principles for practical and pragmatic use in the field. In February this year, dear colleagues, I visited Mosul, the site of a key battle in the war in Iraq, which was characterized by intense street-by-street, house-to-house fighting over the last couple of years. It is a shell of a city today, and I was frankly shocked to see the extent of the destruction. Talking to families, I heard how war has extracted a huge and painful toll. The whereabouts of so many people are unknown today. I met mothers and family members desperately searching for sons and husbands and sisters, feared dead or detained. Millions remain displaced within Iraq and in neighboring countries without a perspective to go home today. Mosul, like Aleppo, Taiz, Maiduguri, are emblematic of the immense suffering that can occur when international humanitarian law is violated. Beyond the immediate impact of death and injury, children have lost years of education. Adults have lost their livelihoods and means of survival. Others suffer from mental scars and trauma. And in this broken community, resentment and risk of reprisal lie under the surface so powerfully and so visibly when you visit the city. When IHL is violated, it always bears the risk of cycles of violence. Conflict shatters life in so many ways. It ostracizes and it divides. Some people are shunned from society, survivors of sexual violence, persons with disabilities, excluded from society in these contexts. They are the ignored, the invisible, the voiceless. They are excluded from basic services, from community life, from education and work. Others are excluded by design and in the name of punishment. Those accused of committing terrorist acts and detained without judicial process, those affiliated with the enemy, including families of foreign fighters. These are enormously difficult dynamics to respond to, and we are seeing the world right now struggling to balance the security imperative of states, justice for victims and survivors, legal obligations towards those associated with the enemy, and humanitarian needs. But these are also the dilemmas where the robust framework of international humanitarian law and international human rights law can add great value. Like the ICRC, they were built exactly for these moments. Colleagues, international humanitarian law makes no judgment on the motive of fighting. It states that every person who is not or no longer actively participating in the hostilities is entitled to protection and must be treated with humanity. Everyone, even the enemy, must be seen as a human and protected. What does this mean in practice? No one shall be subject to torture or to other forms of ill treatment. Rape and other forms of sexual violence are prohibited. The wounded and sick must be given medical care. Hospitals and medical personnel must not be attacked. People who are detained must be treated humanely. Family members have the right to know the fate of their relatives. The dead must be treated with dignity. Sounds simple, is very difficult. When international humanitarian law is respected, harm to civilians is drastically reduced. Every day we see international humanitarian law in action. When the wounded person is allowed through a checkpoint, when a child on the front lines receives food and other humanitarian aid, when the living conditions of detainees are improved, or when they can receive contact with their families, then we know that the law is present and guiding actions of belligerents. The 1949 conventions were the first treaties to prohibit rape and other forms of sexual violence in armed conflict. In 1949, states made clear once and for all that there is no place for the belief that sexual violence is unavoidable in war. Today, rape and other forms of sexual violence are recognized as war crimes in all armed conflicts. We are painfully aware that this has not stopped sexual violence from being committed. Let's be very clear about it. The norm doesn't prevent the violation of the norm. It remains a brutal and unacceptable reality for women, men, and children in many armed conflicts today. But at the same time, continued violations of the law do not mean that the law is inadequate, but rather that efforts to ensure respect are inadequate. Indeed, in conflicts across the world, we see enormous violations of international humanitarian law. Tragic examples from Yemen, Somalia, Nigeria, Ukraine, and elsewhere, which demonstrate that there are terrible failures to protect people each and every day. These violations can lead to the perception that the principles are never respected or that they are not relevant. But it would be wrong and indeed dangerous to believe that international humanitarian law is always and only violated and is therefore useless. The singular focus on violations of the law risks to delegitimize the law over time and to miss those hundreds and thousands of situations where the law is effectively respected. The hospitals and water systems not attacked, the civilians spared, the detainees treated humanely. That is also a reality. Our collective challenge today is to find ways to ensure greater respect within the changing dynamics of conflict and to see how we can enhance the positive example and how we can minimize the violations. It is true, of course, that the wars of 2019 have changed significantly since the Second World War when the conventions were devised. We are all aware that there have been fewer international armed conflicts while non-international ones have multiplied. We have spoken in this auditorium at other occasions on this phenomenon. Today, too, conflicts have become more intractable. The The Second World War lasted 6 years. Many of the conflicts we see today have lasted for years or decades, affecting generations. You have heard me say that in other occasions. The average presence of ICRC in our 15 largest operation is more than 30 years. Average, more than 30 years. Battles are fought in populated areas today, risking too many civilian lives and destroying critical infrastructure. In protracted urban wars, we are seeing greater numbers of people affected for long periods and with deep needs, from food, water, and shelter to healthcare services and economic opportunities and the need for psychosocial support. The humanitarian agenda has enlarged considerably over the past couple of years. The global landscape of conflict has also changed. A vast array of armies, special forces, armed groups, private military and security company, criminal gangs now fight with weapons which were reserved in the past to armies, fight directly or by proxy, openly or secretly. ICRC research shows more armed groups have emerged in the last 6 years than in the previous 6 decades. That's a lot of armed groups, and it's a lot of fragmentation of actors in the battlefields. The ICRC today talks to all parties to a conflict and strives to engage with an increasingly complex array of non-state armed groups. Currently, we are in contact with more than 200 groups worldwide linked to our operations or our humanitarian concerns in specific areas. And we are discovering that the structure of these groups mean that we need new approaches to engage with those groups. Our research shows that decentralized groups, especially non-state armed groups, are often influenced by the command structures, but also by many other factors: community, political, spiritual. We have to engage with those communities in order to be able also to influence the groups. We need to do more to influence the networks in which these groups strive, including at an informal level, not only on formal law. The ICRC must encourage groups to recognize that behavior which flouts the law is again their own ideals. It is against their own ideals, against the ideals of this group. We have to enshrine a consciousness that violating the law, committing cruelty, is not what the soldiers and fighters are and want to be. Today, wars also increasingly involve partners and allies who are outside of a theater of conflict. Our contemporary experience shows, and Syria, Iraq, and others are telling examples, our experience shows how this can lead to the illusion of responsibility, the fragmentation of chains of command, and an unchecked flow of weapons. We have seen much of it over the last couple of years, of weeks and months, de-responsibilizing countries or de-responsible statement for what they are doing in other places in the world. As the trend towards allied and partnered warfare only increases, it has become urgent for states to look at how they can influence their partners and calibrate their support to ensure civilians are better protected. And as states engage in new counter-terrorist activities, it is essential that their actions do not infringe on the vital work of humanitarian organizations which seek only the help to help victims of armed conflict and violence. Dear colleagues, while conflicts evolve in nature, likewise, international humanitarian law is not static. Since its inception, the ICRC observed the suffering caused by weapons and certain tactics of warfare and has sought to curb the worst excesses. It made a public call against the use of chemical weapons during World War I and against nuclear weapons after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It worked to expand the protective scope of international humanitarian law from combatants to civilians with the Fourth Geneva Conventions. The inclusion of Common Article 3 on non-international armed conflict in 1949 somehow anticipated the massive shift to that type of conflict later on, with a further development of those protections in additional Protocol 2. In today's battlefields, some particularly challenging developments have emerged, though. Armed actors and civilians intermingling, and individuals changing from fighters at night to civilians by daylight. Different forms of violence blending together on increasingly fuzzy battlefields with military use of force, criminal and inter-community violence coexisting in the same space. The blurring of lines between international and internal armed conflict, between physical and virtual forms of violence, or between those participating in hostilities and those not. Asymmetric warfare emerging as a predominant conflict environment. Distinctions between weapons, dual-use goods, and between military and civilian activities blurring. Terrorism and counterterrorism entrenched in dynamics of conflict. The increasing instrumentalization of humanitarian action for political purposes and humanitarian action criminalized as strategic support for the enemy. All these elements are part of our daily life today as a humanitarian organization. This means that it is increasingly difficult to look at international humanitarian law in isolation, and it forces us to also consider other sources of law when operating in complex environment: human rights law, national and regional legal frameworks, soft law, and policy guidances. Today, we are also seeing rapidly developing technologies create new front lines in cyberspace and new ways to fight, such as autonomous weapon systems and remote technologies. The ICRC is particularly concerned about the potential human cost of cyber operations and is therefore engaged in clarifying the significance of basic IHL concepts in view of these new technological developments. IHL is clear and prohibits cyber attacks against civilian objects and prohibits indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks. But in cyberspace, which is almost entirely dual use, what do these rules mean? How can we attribute attacks in cyberspace? What triggers a conflict? More tailor-made rules to protect civilians from conflicts' future front lines may be needed in the future. We are certainly working on these issues. Dear colleagues, 70 years on, the Geneva Conventions are much more than a legacy or simply something to be proud of and to commemorate. A lot has been achieved since 1949 in spreading knowledge of the law, ensuring its implementation and incorporation into military doctrine, education, training, sanctions mechanisms preventing its violations. Again, a lot has been achieved, but much more needs to be done. This is what ICRC staff strive to do every day across the globe as they witness the plight of children, women, and men whose humanity and dignity is denied in today's conflicts. We would be worth without the conventions. They are, at 70, still fit for purpose in many respects, but they need better support, more powerful advocates, and a spirit of innovation to charter new ways forward for enhancing the protection of populations through law in a new world with new forms of violence. The conventions were made for all of us in the name of humanity. While states and belligerents first and foremost have the responsibility to implement the conventions, they are also our collective responsibility to watch over. On this anniversary, ICRC calls on states and non-state actors to universally and unequivocally respect, implement, and ensure respect for international humanitarian law. But appeals do not suffice. What is most needed today is at the core of ICRC's work at the front line of contemporary warfare. The ability to build more trustful relationships between belligerents so that the consensual space for enhanced behavior is reclaimed and rebuilt. We won't have better respect if we don't have more trust amongst belligerents that the norms are the basis to respect and will be respected because the adversary is respecting them. Fierce public defense of practical rules of international humanitarian law is crucial too. We all know how easy it is to be overwhelmed and to turn away from ongoing suffering around the world. When the ICRC last surveyed the public about their attitudes to international humanitarian law, we found that over 2/3 of people think it makes sense to impose limits to war and violence. But we also saw how people are becoming resigned to the death of civilians as an inevitable part of war. We need champions for humanity at all levels to step forward. We need people and organizations to support the humanitarian mission with their skills and knowledge, with their resources, and even more so with their voices. Students and the scientific community can greatly contribute to upholding respect for IHL. We need cutting-edge research to inform evidence-based humanitarian action and diplomacy today. We need scientists to help put innovations at the service of humanity and avert new means and method of warfare, eroding the protection enshrined in the Geneva Conventions. And in this light, it is positive to see so many of you here tonight, to see strong academic engagement in so many universities around the globe, and many students and researchers engaging on international humanitarian law. Let us remember that the spirit of the conventions, to uphold human dignity even in the midst of war, is as important now as it was then. Let us always remember that the conventions are law, but somehow transcend the law also. So what they require is not only legal, but it is just and right. Let us all of us do what we can to ensure that this spirit prevails. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and later on to your questions. Thank you very much.
Nous avons le plaisir de continuer avec une conversation modérée par Anissa Bellal, chercheur à l'Académie de droit international humanitaire et des droits humains, un centre conjoint de l'Institut et de l'Université de Genève, que je remercie d'avoir accepté ce rôle. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Burin. Thank you very much, Peter Maurer, for these very encouraging words. And I also take note of the important role that students, researchers, academics can play in getting involved into international humanitarian law and promoting humanitarian norms. You said in your speech that you recently visited Iraq, but I know that you've been also in Mali, in Syria, you regularly visit the fields. What do you take from these experiences does the message of the Geneva Conventions is still heard by the victims in this context?
Well, I think it always surprises me when I visit regions of conflicts how much alive in the societies, in war-torn societies, the basic spirit of limiting bad behavior in war is, and how conscious societies are about the existence of these norms. They may not know the paragraph of the Geneva Conventions which has been violated and under which they suffer. But it is interesting to see how broad in today's societies and environment the consciousness about the existence of these laws are, and how much people know that they are exposed to violations of norms and principles and laws. And what I find interesting when you engage with populations is also how far they go in their courage to demand respect for these norms, even if this is a further risk to their survival. It has been not broadly known in many of the contexts when I look over the last couple of years, that in Iraq and Syria, in jihadi-controlled territories, in the Boko Haram-controlled territories, that women went to the street to protest against violations of international law. And so I think it is important to recognize that, again, what I wanted to express in my introduction, that these norms are norms because states devised them as norms, but they are more than norms because they reflect century-old ethical behaviors in societies which transcend the Christian sort of European space of cultural space, but is tapping much more into intercultural experience. And you know, Anissa, I'm sure you have seen when we made that poll in 17 countries around the world, it was interesting that those knowing most about international law are the populations in countries who are exposed to war. And those who know least about international humanitarian law in the sample that we have done were the Swiss and the Americans. Just to remind you, if you are affected, you know what the norms are and where the norms have been violated. Interesting.
Another question that I would like to ask is linked to the involvement of different states in international coalitions in different conflicts. Of course, you talk to the victims, but you also talk to ministers of foreign affairs, you talk to heads of states. How do you convince them to also play a role in supporting the implementation of international humanitarian law by all the different parties to these armed conflicts?
Well, it's indeed a difficult sell, Anissa, because I think you convince them on the concrete example, and I think we have to recognize that most of the belligerent countries in the 1990s and in the decade after of the new century today are retrieving from active direct participation in battlefields and are delegating their combat operations to national, state and non-state local actors where they are. And they are supporting those actors. And again, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, you name it, are examples on how today wars are waged. And we all know support of means a lot of things. It can mean training, and it can mean giving them software to target objects and to be better in targeting. It can mean massive weapons delivery. It can mean a lot of different activities. And I think one of the political conundrum, and this is a political and not a legal conundrum, is that states resent to engage themselves and support frontline states to lead war, to engage in wars, because they don't have the political legitimacy to directly involve in wars. We have seen in Europe the ability to directly engage in wars today is limited to one country, which has a political legitimacy to fight outside its border. And in all other countries, warfare, except for Chapter 7 operations and peacebuilding and peacekeeping operations of the under UN Charter, are difficult to have to be led with political legitimacy. And so I think in this situation and delegation of war, it's also difficult to convince, because what is happening because it's politically feasible for those who beforehand have directly engaged. The Americans were in Afghanistan, they were in Iraq. Today they support parties to conflict in Libya, in Yemen and in other places. And we see it again with the other big powers as well. And so I think it's a long-term engagement that my organization has started to convince by evidence that you can't just steal yourself out of the responsibility, and at the end of the day you are bearing some of the costs. When you transfer weapon without instructing your partners how to use weapons in conformity with international humanitarian law, the political backfiring happens as well. And so we are at the present moment in these limbo situations where on the one side, body politics in Europe, in the US, and in many other countries resent going to war. And so partnered and allied warfare is a new phenomenon. But when the effects and impact of partnered warfare comes to the public debates in the same countries, it's also difficult to sustain a situation where you steal yourself out of responsibility. And so one of the big efforts today is also to look at positive examples. How can we leverage influence of states so they try to use their influence not only to transfer weapons and instruct armed forces, but also to convince their partners to behave. And I think this positive approach is what we are trying to do today, and I don't pretend it is easy. And we need the militaries to do so. At the end of the day, the militaries are those who are closest to the effects of warfare, and they do have to understand that the reputational risk of supporting a partner is almost as big as the reputational risk of engaging yourself and not behaving according to the law in certain contexts. But it is a big issue, and I think it's a relatively new issue which comes to our workload. You may have seen, and some of you who are specialists of international affairs may have seen, that we have been able to insert in some of the multilateral organizations' communiques wording which recognizes responsibility. The G7 communique of foreign ministers in May last year in Canada has recognized that partnered warfare is an important new phenomenon, and the G7 want to be responsible partners and want that international humanitarian law is respected. So there is, at least at the level of principle, a recognition that this is a problem. In terms of practice, there is a long way to go till influence is leveraged into change of behavior.
Perhaps one last question from my side. You've talked about technology, new technology, and its impact on armed conflict, and especially cyber warfare and new types of weapons. But technology can also be an opportunity. We know, for example, that refugees or victims of armed conflict, that their use and their access to mobile phones is very important to them, only to stay in touch with their family. So according to you, what are the challenges that this new type of technology, but also opportunity, can raise for humanitarian action, especially considering that the victims must also be protected against an abusive use of their data?
Well, Anais, you have alluded to two levels which are a particular preoccupation of ours. As I have spoken tonight about the Geneva Conventions, there is a normative level. How do we translate legal obligations which have been conceived for other types of battlefields, for physical battlefields, into the virtual space of cyber conflict, cyber warfare, cyber security? What is war in cyberspace? What is an attack in cyberspace? This is a legal work of clarification and harmonization and interpretation of international humanitarian law, to which the ICRC is engaged and looks to engage with states and with experts of states in order to generate a level of consensus on how we read a traditional grammar in the light of new developments. It's a translation issue first and foremost, and eventually it will be maybe also a lawmaking issue when we discover that certain areas are not satisfactorily regulated and are unsatisfactorily clear with regard to the behavior of belligerents. So that's the legal level. On the level of protecting and assisting populations, it is obvious that new technology offer a lot of opportunities, and they offer and engage us in risks. And the problem with all new technology and with all new introduction of technology is that when you use it the first time, you don't exactly know what the opportunities are and what the risks are. You only know that there are risks and opportunities. Having the internet and cash services and transfer of cash to mobile phones is, of course, an enormous opportunity, because in situations where markets still work, it's a fast way to support people and to give aid and possibilities of survival by giving them cash, because with cash they can buy the daily utilities. And so that's a huge opportunity, and we have seen that we can reach with less dangerous and less cumbersome engagement more people and help them survive. But everybody knows, and you have alluded, Anissa, that if these datas, which are basically part of big data, are transformed into metadata and data analytics, the same data that are transferring assistance to people and helping them survive can helping adversaries identify them and target them in an attack. and it can offer valuable information which in past warfares has been considered secret, can become common knowledge, including by belligerents. And so that's one of the reasons why I think the introduction of new technologies, in particular with regard to the management of data, is challenging us on our data protection policy. What can we offer? How protective do we have to be in order to protect people and not to expose them to unnecessary risk? And the problem is, we may not exactly know yet what the level of risk is, and even worse, people may not know themselves what the risks are when they switch on their telephone and when they use communication tools in order to protect themselves. And I think this is the big issue with which we are confronted today. I see no alternative than, as ICRC, to put our protection mandate center stage and to reflect how we can add additional layers of protective capacities to the data we are assembling, because if we don't, we will lose the trust of populations in our effectiveness and ability to operate in the field. And I think that's what it is all about. We know that we are handling very often more sensitive information already today when we don't have digital data carriers. But with digital data carriers, we have to add additional protective layers. I give you another example. It was in the news recently as a debate. Today, donors ask accountability in detailed accountability for our assistance programs. They want to know where our assistance is going. Iris-Scan methodology is used in the field by many agencies, but Iris-Scan is at the same time an exposure to risk. So how do we balance opportunities and risk? How we find also amongst belligerents agreements not to use a certain type of data in order to agree on minimal protective standards. I think it's an open field which is of critical importance. And if I may make a last comment, we are, of course, interested as an organization with a seat here in Geneva and in Switzerland to use the protective capacity of Swiss universities, of Swiss cyber specialists in order to protect humanitarian action. And we are relying also on Switzerland as a host country to spearhead some of the discussion in the international arena on finding an agreement amongst belligerents on what data to use and not to use in order to remain and to keep a minimal trust of populations in humanitarian work. So an enormously big challenge in the big field, but I certainly wanted to assure also you and this audience that I think we are chartering our way forward. We are precautiously introducing new technology. We are trying to find the best possible protective technologies also in the use of those data. And we are looking for a consensus also in the international community how best to proceed in order to maximize use and to minimize misuse.
So a role of science not only in developing weapons, but also in developing protection of IHL, yes.
Yes, and it's interesting, I think, in terms of lawmaking, that we see today how important it is to understand the technicity of of the data and of data flows. And this changes, of course, the ball games. You have always to understand as a lawyer what the object is on which you legislate. The problem is that some of the objects in the past have been easily accessible, and today the complexity of data management and data protection policies is just a new frontier to charter and an important issue to consider.
Thank you. We now have time for some questions. Please, when you want to take the floor, introduce yourselves, and also please ask questions and not make comments, because we want to have enough time for everyone to ask questions. So we have about 20 minutes for questions. Who wants to start? Yes, please, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Maurer, for the thought-provoking address. My name is Purujit, and I'm a student at the Institute. So you had said something about looking past the enemy and seeing them as human. And I was curious, do you think those cases are going to get more complex, where you could have a situation where a 19-year-old girl has gone to Syria to fight for ISIS, but then wants to come back to the UK, and then her citizenship is revoked? So can the international humanitarian law community draw some kind of objective line, or is that something that we're going to get increasingly more difficult to face?
Perhaps we take a couple of questions. Another question? Yes, please.
Peter, it's good to see you. Can I ask you this? When you go to Beijing or Moscow or Washington or Riyadh, and you seek support for international humanitarian law, what kind of responses do you get? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond. On the first question, I think it's a very topical question, and we have seen that it is now part of public policy debate, not only in the UK, but in Europe. And we know that thousands of Europeans have left to fight, and some of them have taken their families and their children. And we do believe that international humanitarian law, but not only international humanitarian law, gives some indications and gives some directions on how to treat these cases. I think nobody is advocating here for impunity. I think those who are responsible for violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law have to be accountable for what they did during the fighting. And I think international humanitarian law ensures that those who are convicted and detained are treated humanely. With regard to those who have accompanied fighters, as you know, ICRC is visiting many of the fighters and many of the families of foreign fighters in Iraq and Syria today. And if they want to return, we make ourselves certainly the intermediaries in order to let the respective governments know that persons want to return. For us, children, in particular those without parents, are of course top priority, and we look to do as best as we can family reunifications. We certainly warn countries to strip people of their nationality, because as advocates of international humanitarian law, we don't want to increase stateless people in the world. That's one of the group of persons which is of concern to us. So while we are, and I think international humanitarian law is not directive where justice is executed, it has nevertheless minimal conditions on how justice is executed. And I think it is important that we respect those guidances which are enshrined in international humanitarian law as well as human rights law, and which are procedural guarantees which must be respected. So there are guidances in both bodies of law, IHL as well as international human rights law, which allow us probably to deal in a better way with the very complex phenomenon. Everybody knows that it is not easy because people have been exposed to terrorist and attacks and therefore to violations of international humanitarian law also in European countries. And therefore, politically, many of the countries and governments are in a difficult position because public opinion doesn't approve of those who have been responsible for terrorist attacks in the past just come home easily. But again, I think at least we have a discussion framework. By the way, also the national legislations of those countries offer basic frameworks, and it is first and foremost according to those frameworks that these cases have to be considered. But I wanted to make a clear point towards your question. Yes, international humanitarian law offers at least some guidance to deliver on those issues. Bertie, with regard to the response I get on international humanitarian law, I would say the following: great enthusiasm and support for international humanitarian law as an idea. I think when we go a little bit more into detail on the how, what would be credible steps to take in order to live up to the normative framework of international humanitarian law, the enthusiasm is not everywhere and always the same on each and every of the issue. Having said that, and this has made me a little bit more supportive over the last couple of years on the diplomacy of law. It is true that if you create a space in which you don't run necessarily to the public space with some of the discussions, you may have more interesting responses. Because many of the belligerents and those supporting belligerents in particular, if we speak about those you mentioned, Bertie, many of those know about some of the difficult dilemmas in which they are, and many of those look for practical solutions. What I can say is that most of the time, the dialogues with militaries are more constructive than with other parts of administrations. Because militaries normally know what they are talking about. And when we talk about international humanitarian law. And so you can at least debate about, as I mentioned, what is exactly your support? How can you leverage influence? How do you train? How do you monitor? How do you vet your partners? What are the criteria? These are all questions to which responsible militaries of big powers normally are able to respond. The response may not be the same that we would give as experts of international humanitarian law and coming from a humanitarian perspective. And there are differences which then again can be debated. But I think what I find encouraging, including in Riyadh, is that the past 3 years in Yemen has certainly brought us much closer to having a professional dialogue with militaries on what distinction, proportionality, precaution, support of, and so on mean. And it has sharpened, I think, the consciousness that there is a body of law to which they have to respect, that they have to comply. It has certainly in certain countries allowed us to open avenues for continuous engagement with the militaries, for trainings, for operational reviews. And here again, in operational reviews, there is no secret. We do not only always agree, but that's probably as far as you get as an organization like the ICRC. I mean, you can try to convince, you can try to make a case, but at the end of the day, arms carriers, state and non-state, have responsibilities. And if they don't change behavior, and if they ponder the interest of military necessity and their protection obligation in a different way, it's very difficult to convince them from the opposite, unless at a certain moment there is also too much and too high of a cost. And cost can be very different. Cost can be that your supporter withdraws arms delivery. That's a cost, so you better comply. Cost can be reputational risk in the public space. But I think it's this delicate balance that we continuously navigate. And you know from our past discussions and from the different functions and institutions that we have represented, I have never said that public advocacy is bad. I have only said that at ICRC, confidential dialogue is probably the avenue we want to go first, which doesn't exclude that other organizations at other moments take other decisions with regard to public advocacy and the privacy of a confidential dialogue with militaries, which we try to use as a platform for changing behavior to the better and according to the norm.
Another question? Yes, please, sir.
Thank you very much, Zhang Tianze from China. And my question is quite simple. The title is Changing the World, Unchanging Protection, the mark. So my question is, in 2 or 3 sentences, can you give an answer, yes or no, or how do you think? Thank you very much.
I would like to take another question, but I would strongly encourage, yes, please, a colleague, a lady colleague.
Hello, I'm Letitia van Haren, cultural anthropologist, and I have an NGO which is called Smart Access to Health and Human Rights for All through new technologies that will interest you. I have 2 questions which are separate, but they're related as well. First of all, aren't you trying to mop the floor with the tap open? The arms industry, the arms trade, is it not there where it should stop? I remember we lived in Senegal and there was a conflict between Senegal and Gambia, and it kind of stopped because they didn't have weapons. I thought it was real big proof of how important this is and how we should stop it there. The second one is about the all-increasing, all-pervasive violence in our own societies, so-called at peace. I mean, the horrible things that can happen, we've heard about in London, the knifings of young teenagers by other young teenagers. This type of violence is also unstoppable, or it's even stronger when you go into armed conflict. What you have in the peaceful society is going to be even 100 times worse. So I find it also very difficult if we don't look at how do we stop this feeding of violence into our minds and brains and hearts constantly, so that sometimes they even have to exaggerate the violence in the past to make a movie about past violence in the history more attractive for the present public. So these are the 2 questions I have about your work. Thank you.
Well, I think while I haven't explicitly responded, the question is yes, yes. The short answer. Yes, the world is changing, and yes, I think I have given a couple of examples in my speech and in my responses up till now that it changes the way we deliver on protection. It changes the environment and it changes the way we engage with parties to conflict and the issues we are raising and the modalities we are engaging. So my response is yes, the world is changing. That's a fact. And I think I wanted to give a couple of examples what the critical areas of change are that we are looking at. And it changes the way we deliver on protection, while I think I made amply clear that we do believe that the normative framework has its enormous validity. But it doesn't mean that ensuring respect for the legal framework is exactly the same as it is in 1945. It has changed and has adapted to the new framework in which we operate. I think you put two very important questions forward. I have briefly alluded in my introductory speech, and I just wanted to come back. An important work stream of my organization is to be an expert in disarmament negotiations. We have a mandate through the Geneva Convention which allows us to and asks us to engage on the impact of new weapons technologies and whether new weapons technology can, or new weapons developed, intrinsically can respect international humanitarian law or not. So we have an entry point into arms and disarmament negotiations, and we haven't used that entry point also, for instance, to participate in the Arms Trade Treaty, which, if it were implemented in good faith, would certainly change the availability of weapons in conflict areas, because one of the famous provisions of the Arms Trade Treaty is that states commit not to export weapons into countries in which there is reason to believe that international humanitarian law is violated. So we all know in that room, and we don't have to fool ourselves, that good faith implementation is not really what we see. And I agree with you that the dynamics of weapons industry is something which is important. Having said that, the availability of weapons is not the only factor, as you have also alluded, which drives violence and conflict. And we also know that even if there are weapons available, the question is, how can we have these weapons used in conformity with the restrictive regimes and with the restrictive regime that international humanitarian law offers, and how can international humanitarian law be respected while weapons are still available? And that's the focus which we take. So for the good and bad, as a humanitarian organization, we don't pronounce ourselves on the reasons which lead to conflict. That's an emancipatory aspect that other international organizations and NGOs are taking. We are trying to limit the impact of, and so we do with regard to weapons. I think the other issue I also wanted briefly to allude, and I think one of the really critical issues which surprise me in today's contexts in which we operate is that we have been used to look at war, and we thought at a certain moment that this was basically such a predominant form of violence that it overshadowed all the others. While today, when we look at most of the conflict, we see the superposition of warfare, intercommunity violence, crime, and I would add domestic violence as well. And I think this is the big challenge also with regard to what we are discussing tonight. And what I alluded to it, because if in the past we had still a relatively easy concept which would associate international humanitarian law as the law regulating war, we have a multiplicity of legal frameworks, and some of them not even existing yet, in order to deal with the other forms of violence. And so where we are, people are killed, wounded, displaced, affected, traumatized by violence. But we never know exactly what is at the origin. Is it war and a violation of international humanitarian law? Is it a violation of human rights law? Is it a violation of other forms of legal frameworks? And this complexifies. And this is also one of the reasons why we think a legalistic approach is not even today the only one. I mean, a legal approach is an important one, and it is important that we remind ourselves that there are legal frameworks. But that's the reason why, for instance, we enter into reflection on behavioral science. What makes it that people respect certain basic norms? And our recent study on the root of restraint is an effort of my organization to go deeper into the drivers of behaviors which make rules respected or disrespected. And I think that's the whole point also of calling for scientific research on the law, because I'm increasingly convinced today that interdisciplinary research is useful and important to have, because we can't just silo our thinking according to legal framework. We have to look at the connectors and connectivities between the different forms of violence, how the different legal frameworks and norms are related to those forms, and how eventually we engage with perpetrators of violence in a way which makes change their behaviors. And we have seen that informal codes in societies and groups of societies are as important as formals are, as formal norms are. People behave not necessarily because something is forbidden, it's because the commander tells them that it is not legal to do. They follow other behavioral impulses, and it's of critical importance that we open our minds and we work also together in a truly collaborative spirit in order to cope with a phenomenon which preoccupies society so deeply.
Thank you. So it is now time to conclude our discussion. If you allow me, I will just say a few words about what we can bring home from what we talked about tonight. So you said that in 1949, and I quote you, states took responsible action and had the courage to uphold principles. That was really strong words that you held. And of course, 70 years later, contexts have changed. There are new challenges, problems of upholding principle in those new challenges. But the Geneva Conventions principles and norms are still valid today. And you have also highlighted, I think it was very important to do so, that IHL, international humanitarian law, is also respected, and that we should also talk more about this. What is needed today, rather, is better ways to implement international humanitarian law and finding more efficient ways to do so. Or in other words, how to put norms into action, which is the theme, I was told, of a new cycle of conferences that the ICRC is organizing in the context of the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, which you inaugurated tonight. So I thank you very much, Peter Maurer, for sharing your thoughts tonight with us. I also would like to thank the audience and also those who are following tonight's discussion online. And I wish you all a very nice evening.